The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Yet somehow they found themselves standing at opposite ends, hearts pounding with the weight of what had just been spoken. Ethan Ross sat on the edge of the couch, his hands trembling slightly as he looked into the eyes of his best friend, the person who had unknowingly held his heart captive for the past 2 years and 7 months. Brandon Parker had just asked him about fate, about whether he believed in it, and then said something that made the entire world tilt on its axis. Meeting you felt like proof, Brandon had whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet apartment they shared, the words carrying a weight that seemed to settle into every corner of the room. The words echoed in Ethan's mind as he struggled to process what he was hearing. Brandon, his straight best friend, the one who had dated countless women and never shown the slightest interest in men, was sitting there with tears in his eyes, talking about fate and proof and meetings that changed everything. The electricity in the air was so thick, Ethan could almost taste it, metallic and sharp against his tongue, and he found himself unable to look away from Brandon's face, searching for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke or misunderstanding. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through their living room window cast golden highlights in Brandon's dark hair, making him look almost ethereal, like something from a dream Ethan had convinced himself could never be real. But there was no joke in Brandon's expression, only vulnerability and fear and something that looked dangerously close to hope. His green eyes, usually so confident and sure, were wide with uncertainty, pupils dilated with what Ethan desperately wanted to believe was the same overwhelming emotion that was currently threatening to stop his heart entirely. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to find his voice, tried to make sense of the moment that felt like it had been torn straight from his most desperate dreams. The apartment around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the space between them on the couch and the weight of unspoken truths that had been building for months like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story of friendship, fate, and the courage to follow your heart is just beginning to unfold. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. To understand how they had arrived at this moment of impossible possibility, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when Ethan Ross first realized he was in love with his best friend and thought it would be the end of the world as he knew it. It had started on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 2 years and 7 months before Brandon would ask about fate. The memory was burned into Ethan's consciousness with the kind of clarity usually reserved for traumatic events or life-changing revelations. Ethan had been making coffee in their shared kitchen, humming absently to himself as he waited for the machine to finish brewing, the familiar ritual of morning preparation providing a comforting routine in his otherwise chaotic graduate student life. The kitchen had been filled with the warm, rich aroma of freshly ground beans, and outside their window, the maple tree in their small courtyard was just beginning to turn the brilliant oranges and reds that marked the beginning of autumn in their college town. Brandon had emerged from his bedroom, hair still messy from sleep, wearing nothing but gray sweatpants that hung low on his hips in a smile that could have powered the entire city. His chest was bare, skin golden from a summer spent outdoors, and there were still pillow creases on his cheek that made him look younger, more vulnerable than his usual confident demeanor suggested. He had wrapped his arms around Ethan from behind in a casual morning hug, the kind they had shared hundreds of times before. His chest warm against Ethan's back as he whispered good morning against his ear, breath still sweet with sleep. But something had been different that morning. Maybe it was the way Brandon's breath had felt warm against his skin, sending shivers down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. Maybe it was the way his arms had lingered just a moment longer than usual, strong and secure around Ethan's waist. Or maybe it was simply that Ethan had finally stopped lying to himself about what he felt. The realization had hit him like a freight train, sudden and devastating and impossible to ignore. He was in love with Brandon Parker, hopelessly and completely in love with his straight best friend who would never see him as anything more than a roommate and confidant. The coffee mug had slipped from Ethan's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in an explosion of ceramic and hot liquid that seemed to echo the destruction happening in his chest. Brandon had immediately released him, stepping back with concern written across his features, asking if he was okay, if he had been burned, completely oblivious to the fact that Ethan's world had just fundamentally shifted on its axis. "I'm fine," Ethan had managed to stammer, dropping to his knees to clean up the mess, grateful for the excuse to hide his face and the tears that were threatening to spill over. Just clumsy. Brandon had knelt beside him, helping to gather the larger pieces of ceramic, their hands brushing as they worked together. Each accidental touch had felt like electricity, like touching a live wire, and Ethan had to concentrate on breathing normally, on not letting his reactions show on his face. "You sure you're okay?" Brandon had asked, genuine concern in his voice. "You seem, I don't know, different this morning." Different didn't begin to cover it. In the span of 30 seconds, Ethan's entire understanding of himself, of his relationship with his best friend, of his future, had been completely rewritten. But he couldn't say that, couldn't explain that he had just realized he was gay, that he was in love, that his heart was breaking and soaring simultaneously. "Just tired," he had said instead, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack his face. "Didn't sleep well last night." Brandon had accepted the explanation, but Ethan had caught him watching him with worried eyes throughout the rest of that morning, clearly sensing that something significant had shifted even if he couldn't identify what it was. The months that followed had been a special kind of torture. Ethan had become an expert at hiding his feelings, at playing the role of the supportive friend who listened patiently while Brandon complained about his various girlfriends and dating disasters. He had perfected the art of the encouraging smile when Brandon brought someone new home, of making himself scarce when romance was in the air, of pretending his heart didn't break a little more each time Brandon kissed someone else goodbye at their front door. The worst part hadn't been the jealousy, though that had been considerable. The worst part had been the way Brandon continued to treat him exactly the same, with the same casual affection and easy intimacy that had always characterized their friendship. If anything, Brandon had become more tactile after that morning, as if sensing Ethan's emotional turmoil and trying to provide comfort in the only way he knew how. Brandon had always been generous with physical affection, the kind of person who hugged freely and thought nothing of casual touches. Before Ethan's revelation, these moments had been comfortable and natural, the easy physicality of close friends who had known each other for years. After, they became exquisite agony. Every time Brandon threw an arm around his shoulders while they watched movies, every time he absently played with Ethan's hair while they talked, every time he pulled him into one of those full-body hugs that lasted just long enough to make Ethan's head spin, it was another reminder of what he could never have. The casual touches that had once been sources of comfort became instruments of torture. When Brandon would sprawl across the couch with his head in Ethan's lap during their weekly movie nights, completely relaxed and trusting, Ethan would have to concentrate on keeping his breathing steady, on not letting his fingers linger too long when he absently combed through Brandon's hair. When Brandon emerged from the shower with just a towel around his waist, water still beating on his shoulders, chatting casually about his day as if he wasn't the most beautiful thing Ethan had ever seen, Ethan would have to find excuses to leave the room before his composure cracked entirely. The summer had been particularly difficult. Brandon had taken up running in the mornings, and he would return to their apartment flushed and breathing hard, his t-shirt clinging to his chest with sweat. He had a habit of stretching in the living room, completely unself-conscious as he worked through his cool-down routine, and Ethan had learned to time his own schedule around these sessions, unable to trust himself to maintain his carefully constructed facade when faced with such casual displays of the body he dreamed about touching. The worst part had been the advice sessions. Brandon had a habit of seeking Ethan's opinion on his relationships, treating him like some kind of expert on matters of the heart despite Ethan's complete lack of romantic experience. He would sprawl across Ethan's bed or curl up next to him on the couch, describing his latest romantic confusion with the kind of detail that made Ethan want to scream. The irony wasn't lost on him that Brandon came to him for relationship advice when Ethan was hopelessly in love with him, like asking a starving man for restaurant recommendations. "Why doesn't she get me the way you do?" Brandon would ask, completely oblivious to the knife he was twisting with every word. "You understand me better than anyone. You know what I'm thinking before I even say it. Why can't I find someone who makes me feel the way you do when we're together?" These conversations were simultaneously the best and worst parts of Ethan's existence. On one hand, they were confirmation that what he and Brandon shared was special, that their connection was deeper and more meaningful than Brandon's relationships with the women he dated. On the other hand, they were torture, forcing Ethan to help Brandon analyze why his relationships weren't working while knowing that the answer was sitting right in front of him. If only Brandon could see it. I don't know, Ethan would say, his voice carefully neutral, despite the chaos in his chest. Maybe you're looking for something that doesn't exist. Maybe you're comparing real people to an impossible standard. But it's not impossible, Brandon would protest, his green eyes intense with frustration. I feel it with you, that easy connection, that sense of being completely understood. I know it's possible because we have it. I just don't understand why I can't find it with someone I'm dating. Ethan had learned to swallow his pain and offer thoughtful responses, to be the friend Brandon needed while dying a little inside. He had become skilled at redirecting conversations when they got too close to dangerous territory, at making excuses when the longing became too much to bear. He had convinced himself that loving Brandon from a distance was enough, that being his best friend was better than risking everything and having nothing at all. But as the months passed, the weight of his secret had grown heavier. There were moments when he caught Brandon looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, moments when their casual touches lingered just a beat too long, moments when the air between them felt charged with something neither of them was willing to name. Ethan had told himself he was imagining things, that his own desperate longing was making him see signs that weren't really there. The turning point had come 3 months ago, on a night that started like any other, but ended with everything changed. Brandon had been dating someone new, a woman named Jessica who worked in marketing and seemed nice enough but never quite fit. She was beautiful and intelligent and successful, everything that should have made her perfect for Brandon. But Ethan could see the same restless dissatisfaction in his friend's eyes that had characterized all of his relationships. Ethan had been grading papers at the kitchen table when Brandon came home from what was supposed to be a romantic dinner, looking frustrated and defeated. His hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of an evening that had gone poorly. "How did it go?" Ethan had asked, though Brandon's expression already told him everything he needed to know. "She's perfect on paper," Brandon had said, slumping into the chair across from Ethan with a heavy sigh. "She's beautiful and smart and funny, and she likes me. She really likes me. But there's something missing, you know? There's always something missing." Brandon had pulled off his tie with jerky, frustrated movements, tossing it onto the table between them. He had looked exhausted, not just physically but emotionally, like he was tired of trying to force connections that didn't come naturally. Ethan had looked up from his work, taking in the dejected slope of Brandon's shoulders and the confusion in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he had asked, though part of him already knew where this conversation was heading. Brandon had been quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands where they lay flat on the table. "I don't know how to explain it," he had finally said, his voice soft and uncertain. "It's like I'm playing a part, like I'm acting the way I think I'm supposed to act instead of just being myself. With Jessica, with all of them, really. I feel like I'm performing instead of connecting." The words had hung between them, heavy with implication. Ethan had felt his heart start to race, sensing something shifting in the dynamic they had maintained for so long. "What does connecting feel like to you?" he had asked carefully, afraid of the answer but unable to stop himself from asking. Brandon had looked up then, meeting Ethan's eyes with an intensity that made him feel exposed, like Brandon could see straight through all his carefully constructed defenses. "It feels like this," he had said simply, gesturing between them, "like what we have, easy and natural and real. I never have to think about what to say or how to act when I'm with you. I can just be myself completely and honestly without worrying about whether you'll still want me around tomorrow." The words had hit Ethan like a physical blow, so close to what he had dreamed of hearing, but still not quite enough to be sure. He had struggled to find a response, to navigate the space between hope and caution. "Maybe that's what you should be looking for," he had managed to say. "Someone who makes you feel like you can be yourself." Brandon had laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's the problem," he had said. "I don't think that person exists. I think what we have is rare, maybe even unique. And I'm starting to wonder if I'm wasting my time looking for something that doesn't exist." The physical contact between them had intensified as well. though so gradually that Ethan might have convinced himself he was imagining it, if not for the way his body responded to every touch. Brandon had always been affectionate, but now his touches lingered longer, carried more weight, seemed to burn against Ethan's skin long after they had ended. When they watched movies together, Brandon would position himself closer on the couch, their thighs pressed together from knee to hip, the heat of his body seeping through the fabric of their clothes. When he hugged Ethan goodbye in the mornings, his arms would tighten just slightly, holding him for an extra beat that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. The most dangerous moments came late at night, when Brandon would appear in Ethan's doorway looking lost and vulnerable, like a child afraid of the dark. "Can I sleep in here tonight?" he would ask, his voice small and uncertain. And Ethan would always say yes, even though sharing a bed with the person he loved was its own special brand of torture. They would lie in the darkness, talking in whispers about everything and nothing, their voices soft and intimate in the quiet room. Sometimes Brandon would reach for Ethan's hand under the covers, threading their fingers together like it was the most natural thing in the world. His palm would be warm and slightly rough from his weekend carpentry projects, and Ethan would focus on memorizing every detail of the contact. The way Brandon's thumb would brush absently across his knuckles, the way their hands fit together like puzzle pieces, finding their match. "I can't sleep when I'm alone anymore," Brandon had admitted one night, his voice barely above a whisper in the darkness. "I keep thinking too much, analyzing everything. But when I'm here with you, my brain finally shuts off. I feel safe here." Those nights left Ethan raw and aching, desperate for more, but terrified of pushing too hard and losing everything. He would lie awake long after Brandon's breathing had evened out in sleep, studying his face in the dim light that filtered through the curtains and wondering what it would be like to wake up next to him every morning, to kiss him good morning instead of just watching him leave. Brandon looked younger in sleep, his face relaxed and peaceful, dark lashes casting shadows on his cheeks, and Ethan would have to resist the urge to reach out and trace the line of his jaw, to brush his hair back from his forehead. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago, on a night when Brandon had arrived home from another failed date, looking more frustrated than Ethan had ever seen him. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there was a wildness in his eyes that spoke of barely contained emotion. He had found Ethan reading in the living room and had immediately launched into a rant about modern dating and the impossibility of finding genuine connection. "I don't understand what's wrong with me," Brandon had said, pacing back and forth in front of the couch like a caged animal. "She was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, successful, interested in all the same things I am. We had everything in common on paper. We talked about books and movies and travel, all the things that should matter. But sitting across from her at dinner, I felt nothing. Less than nothing. I felt like I was wasting both our time, going through the motions of a date when all I wanted to do was come home." His movements had been agitated, restless, and Ethan could see the genuine distress in his expression. This wasn't just disappointment about another failed relationship. This was something deeper, more fundamental. Ethan had set his book aside, giving Brandon his full attention. "Maybe you're looking for the wrong things," he had suggested gently, his heart hammering as he ventured into dangerous territory. Brandon had stopped pacing, turning to face him with an expression that was part confusion and part desperation. "Then what should I be looking for?" he had asked, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "Because whatever it is, I'm clearly missing it. I'm 26 years old, and I've never had a relationship that felt real. I've never been with someone who made me want to stay instead of looking for an excuse to leave." The question had hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Ethan had felt the familiar war between hope and fear raging in his chest, the desire to tell Brandon the truth battling with the terror of ruining everything they had built together. "Maybe you should stop looking," Ethan had said finally, his voice carefully measured. "Maybe you should pay attention to what you already have instead of searching for something new." Brandon had stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "What I already have," he had repeated slowly, like he was testing the words, exploring their meaning. The conversation had ended there, with Brandon retreating to his room and leaving Ethan alone with his racing heart and the growing certainty that something fundamental was changing between them. The next morning, Brandon had been quieter than usual, thoughtful in a way that made Ethan nervous. He had caught Brandon watching him several times throughout the day, his gaze intense and searching, like he was seeing him for the first time. The week that followed had been filled with charged moments and meaningful looks, conversations that danced around the edges of confession without quite crossing the line. Brandon had grown more tactile, finding excuses to touch Ethan's arm when they talked, to brush his fingers against his when they passed each other coffee cups, to stand just a little too close when they cooked dinner together. The air between them had been thick with unspoken possibilities. Every interaction weighted with the potential for everything to change. 3 days ago, Brandon had asked the question that had started it all. They had been sitting on the couch after dinner, Ethan grading papers while Brandon pretended to watch television. The silence between them had felt different, heavier somehow, weighted with unspoken thoughts and careful observations. "Do you believe in fate?" Brandon had asked suddenly, his voice quiet and uncertain, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Ethan had looked up from his work, surprised by the question and the serious tone in which it had been delivered. "I don't know," he had answered honestly, setting down his red pen and giving Brandon his full attention. "Why do you ask?" Brandon had been quiet for a moment, staring at his hands where they rested on his knees. "I've been thinking about how we met," he had said, his voice soft and contemplative. "About how random it was. You were looking for a roommate. I was looking for a place to live. We could have easily never crossed paths, but we did, and it changed everything for me." The words had sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, hope and fear warring in his chest as he tried to interpret what Brandon was really saying. Ethan had felt his heart start to race, sensing that they were approaching territory they had never explored before. "How did it change everything?" he had asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid to speak too loudly and break whatever spell was settling between them. Brandon had looked up then, meeting his eyes with an intensity that made Ethan feel like he was being seen for the first time, like all his carefully constructed defenses were transparent. "You became the most important person in my life," he had said simply, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning. "You became my home. And I keep thinking that maybe that wasn't an accident. Maybe some things are just meant to be raised." The words had hit Ethan like a physical blow, so close to what he had dreamed of hearing, but still not quite enough to be sure. He had struggled to find a response, to navigate the space between hope and caution, between the desire to reach for what Brandon seemed to be offering and the fear that he was misreading the situation entirely. "I think some connections are stronger than others," he had managed to say, his voice carefully neutral despite the chaos in his chest. "I think some people are meant to find each other." Brandon had nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Ethan's face, studying his expression like he was searching for hidden meanings in every micro-expression. "That's what I think too," he had said, his voice growing stronger, more certain. "And I think maybe I've been looking for the wrong kind of connection my whole life." The words had hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and Ethan had felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He had wanted to ask what Brandon meant, wanted to push for clarification, but fear had held him back, the terror that he was projecting his own desperate hopes onto innocent words. The conversation had ended there, but something had shifted between them, something fundamental and irreversible. The next 2 days had been filled with a tension that was almost unbearable, every interaction charged with possibility and unspoken questions. Brandon had grown even more affectionate, even more deliberate in his touches, his gaze lingering on Ethan's face in a way that made his skin burn. Last night, Brandon had appeared in Ethan's doorway again, but this time he hadn't asked to sleep in the bed. Instead, he had stood there for a long moment, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, his hands clenched at his sides and his expression torn between fear and determination. "I keep having this dream," he had finally said, his voice so quiet Ethan had to strain to hear him. "We're sitting on the couch just like we always do, but everything is different. You're looking at me the way I've always wanted someone to look at me, and I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not." Ethan had felt his breath catch, his heart pounding so hard he was sure Brandon could hear it across the room. "What happens in the dream?" he had asked, his voice barely audible. Brandon had smiled then, soft and vulnerable and heartbreakingly beautiful, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I tell you the truth," he had said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. I tell you that I think I've been in love with you for months and was too scared to admit it, even to myself. I tell you that every relationship I've tried to have has failed because I keep comparing everyone to you, and they all come up short. The words had hung in the air between them, impossible and perfect and terrifying. Ethan had stared at Brandon, searching his face for any sign that this was still part of the dream. But Brandon had looked back at him with complete sincerity, his vulnerability written clearly across his features. "Is this still the dream?" Ethan had whispered, his voice breaking on the question. Brandon had shaken his head slowly, taking a tentative step into the room. "No," he had said, his voice stronger now, more certain. "This is me, awake and terrified and hoping you might feel the same way." That conversation had led them to this moment, to Brandon sitting on the edge of the couch asking about fate and telling Ethan that meeting him felt like proof of something bigger than chance. The weight of months of hidden feelings and careful conversations had brought them to this precipice, this moment where everything could change or everything could shatter. Ethan looked at Brandon now, taking in the vulnerability in his expression, the way his hands trembled slightly as he waited for a response. The apartment felt impossibly quiet around them, as if the entire world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The late afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the room, and somewhere in the distance, Ethan could hear the sound of their neighbor's dog barking. Normal life continuing while his own world hung in the balance. "I do believe in fate," Ethan said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest, despite the way his hands were shaking as he reached for the courage he had been building for 2 years and 7 months. "And I think you're right about meeting each other. I think some people are meant to find each other, even when they don't know what they're looking for." Brandon's face softened at his words, relief and hope warring in his expression, tears threatening to spill over as he processed what Ethan was saying. "I've been so scared," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Scared of what it means, scared of changing everything between us, scared of losing the most important person in my life. But I'm more scared of pretending anymore. I'm tired of acting like what I feel for you is just friendship when it's so much more than that." The confession hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying in its honesty. Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as he processed what Brandon was saying. The words he had dreamed of hearing for so long finally being spoken in the quiet sanctuary of their shared living room. "How long?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment they had created. "How long have you felt this way?" Brandon was quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping to his hands where they rested on his knees, fingers twisting together in a nervous gesture Ethan had seen countless times before, but never understood the significance of. "I think part of me has always known," he said slowly, his voice thoughtful and uncertain. "But I was too scared to admit it, even to myself. It started becoming impossible to ignore about 6 months ago, when you got sick with that flu, and I realized I'd never been so terrified of losing someone in my entire life." Ethan remembered that week vividly. He had been laid up in bed with a fever that had spiked dangerously high, and Brandon had taken time off work to take care of him, bringing him soup and medicine and sitting by his bedside reading aloud when Ethan was too weak to focus on anything himself. "I kept thinking about how empty the apartment felt when you weren't well enough to be yourself," Brandon continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in the confession. "How much I missed your laugh, your terrible jokes, the way you hum while you're grading papers. Every relationship I tried to have after that felt wrong because I kept comparing everyone to you. I kept thinking about how easy it was to be with you, how safe I felt when we were together, how much I looked forward to coming home to you every day." The words sent warmth spreading through Ethan's chest, even as his heart ached for the months of confusion and fear Brandon had endured. He thought about all the nights Brandon had come home frustrated from dates, all the conversations about feeling like he was performing instead of connecting, and suddenly everything made sense. "I wish you had told me sooner," Ethan said softly, reaching out to cover Brandon's restless hands with his own, feeling the tremor that ran through Brandon at the contact. Brandon looked up at him, fear flickering in his green eyes like candlelight. "Why?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "What would you have said?" Ethan took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything between them forever, that there would be no going back to the careful friendship they had maintained for so long. "I would have told you that I've been in love with you for 2 years and 7 months," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I would have told you that every day of pretending to be just your friend has been the most beautiful torture I've ever experienced. I would have told you that you're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I fall asleep. That I know exactly how you take your coffee and what makes you laugh and the way you look when you're concentrating on something important." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and completely vulnerable. Brandon stared at him, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked like wonder, his mouth slightly open as he processed what Ethan had just revealed. 2 years and 7 months, Brandon repeated, his voice barely audible, like he was testing the weight of the words. Ethan nodded, feeling tears start to slide down his cheeks as the relief of finally speaking the truth warred with the terror of potential rejection. "I remember the exact day I realized it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You hugged me in the kitchen while I was making coffee, and something just clicked. I knew I was in love with you, and I thought it would kill me because I was sure you could never feel the same way." Brandon was quiet for a long moment, processing what Ethan had told him, his thumb brushing absently across Ethan's knuckles where their hands were still joined. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion and something that sounded like regret. "All this time," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "all this time we've been dancing around each other, both too scared to say what we really felt." Ethan wiped at his eyes with his free hand, trying to compose himself. "I didn't want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought being your friend was better than risking everything and having nothing at all." Brandon reached out then, his fingers brushing against Ethan's cheek, wiping away the tears that continued to fall. The touch was gentle but electric, sending shivers down Ethan's spine and making his breath catch in his throat. "You could never lose me," he said softly, his voice full of certainty and tenderness. "You're too important to me. You're everything to me." The touch was gentle but electric, sending shivers down Ethan's spine. He leaned into Brandon's hand, closing his eyes as he savored the contact he had dreamed about for so long, the warmth of Brandon's palm against his skin, feeling like coming home after a long journey. "What happens now?" Ethan whispered, afraid to open his eyes and break the spell, afraid that this moment was too perfect to be real. Brandon's thumb brushed across his cheekbone, tender and sure, the touch reverent and careful like Ethan was something precious and fragile. "Now we stop pretending," he said, his voice full of determination and hope. "Now we stop being scared of what this is and let ourselves have it." Ethan opened his eyes then, meeting Brandon's gaze and finding nothing but love and certainty there. The fear was still present, but it was overshadowed by hope, by the possibility of having everything he had ever wanted, everything he had convinced himself was impossible. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the question. "Are you sure this is what you want? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. Everything changes." Brandon smiled then, soft and beautiful and completely certain, his eyes bright with tears and joy and something that looked like relief. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "I want this. I want you. I want us." The words were like a key turning in a lock, opening a door that had been closed for far too long. Ethan felt something break open in his chest. All the love and longing he had kept carefully contained for months, finally free to breathe, to exist in the light instead of hidden in the shadows. "Can I kiss you?" Brandon asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his face so close that Ethan could feel his breath against his lips. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly, his heart hammering so hard he was sure Brandon could feel it. Brandon leaned forward slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted to. But Ethan had never wanted anything more in his life. When their lips finally met, it was soft and tentative at first, a question being asked and answered, months of careful distance and hidden longing finally finding expression. The kiss deepened as they both realized this was real. This was happening. This was everything they had both been afraid to want. Brandon's hand cupped Ethan's face while his other arm pulled him closer, and Ethan melted into the embrace he had dreamed about for so long. The kiss tasted like hope and possibility and coming home, like everything he had ever wanted wrapped up in this perfect moment. Brandon's lips were soft and warm, moving against his with a tenderness that made Ethan's chest ache with the intensity of his emotion. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together as they tried to process what had just happened. Ethan could feel Brandon's heart racing against his chest, matching the frantic rhythm of his own. And he marveled at the fact that this was real, that Brandon was really here in his arms, that this wasn't another one of his desperate dreams. Wow, Brandon whispered, his voice filled with wonder and something that sounded like awe. Yeah, Ethan agreed, unable to stop smiling despite the tears that were still sliding down his cheeks. Wow. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other close and marveling at the fact that this was real, that they were finally here after so much time spent wanting and waiting. The apartment around them felt different now, charged with new possibility, like everything had shifted into its proper place. The familiar furniture, the pictures on the walls, the books scattered across the coffee table, everything looked the same, but felt completely transformed, like they were seeing their home through new eyes. I can't believe we waited so long, Brandon said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on Ethan's back, each touch sending sparks of electricity through his nervous system. Ethan pulled back slightly so he could look into Brandon's eyes, seeing his own joy reflected there along with something deeper, something that looked like profound relief. Maybe we needed to wait, he said, his voice thoughtful. Maybe we needed to be sure to understand what this really means. Brandon nodded, his expression growing serious as the full weight of what they were embarking on settled between them. This changes everything, he said, his voice quiet but certain. Our friendship, our living situation, everything. Are you ready for that? Ethan considered the question, thinking about all the ways their relationship would need to evolve, all the challenges they would face as they navigated this new reality together. There would be difficult conversations with family and friends, questions about their future, the need to redefine every aspect of their relationship. But when he looked at Brandon, when he saw the love and hope in his eyes, he knew there was only one answer. I'm ready, he said firmly, his voice strong with a conviction. I've been ready for 2 years and 7 months. I'm tired of hiding how I feel. I'm tired of pretending that what we have is just friendship. When mother's so much more than that, Brandon smiled, relief washing over his features like sunrise breaking over the horizon. Good, he said, his arms tightening around Ethan, because I don't think I could go back to pretending now, not after this. They talked through the night, finally able to voice all the feelings they had kept hidden for so long. Their conversation flowing with the ease of two people who had been waiting their entire lives to have this discussion. Brandon told Ethan about the months of confusion and self-discovery, about realizing that what he felt for him was different from anything he had ever experienced with women. He talked about the fear of coming out, of changing his entire understanding of himself, but also about the relief of finally admitting the truth. I kept thinking I was broken, Brandon admitted as they curled together on the couch, Ethan's head resting on his shoulder. Like there was something wrong with me because I couldn't connect with anyone the way I was supposed to. But I wasn't broken. I was just looking in the wrong direction. Ethan shared his own journey, the agony of loving someone he thought he could never have, the careful balance of being supportive while protecting his own heart. They talked about all the moments that had led them here, all the signs they had both been too scared to acknowledge, the gradual realization that what they shared was more than either of them had ever experienced before. Do you remember that night last winter when the power went out? Ethan asked, his fingers playing with the hem of Brandon's shirt. Brandon chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest where Ethan's head rested. We lit every candle we could find and played board games by candlelight. You beat me at Scrabble 3 times in a row. I kept thinking how perfect it was, Ethan said softly. How right it felt to be there with you in the dark, like we were the only 2 people in the world. I wanted to tell you then how I felt, but I was too scared. Brandon's hand found his hair, fingers combing through the strands with a gentleness that made Ethan's eyes flutter closed. I wanted to kiss you that night, he admitted quietly, when you were concentrating on your tiles, biting your lip the way you do when you are thinking hard. I kept imagining what it would be like to lean over and kiss you, and it terrified me because I'd never wanted to kiss a man before. As the sun began to rise, they were still curled together on the couch, Ethan's head on Brandon's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The conversation had evolved from confessions to plans, from fear to excitement about their future together. The morning light streaming through their windows felt different now, warmer somehow, like the world itself was celebrating their newfound honesty. "What do we tell people?" Ethan asked, tracing lazy circles on Brandon's shirt, marveling at the fact that he could touch him like this now, that this casual intimacy was finally allowed. Brandon was quiet for a moment, considering the question and all its implications. "We tell them the truth," he said finally, his voice steady and sure, "that we fell in love with each other, that sometimes the best relationships grow from the strongest friendships." Ethan lifted his head to look at him, seeing the determination in his expression, despite the vulnerability that still lingered in his eyes. "Are you ready for that?" he asked carefully. "For people to know you're with a man?" Brandon's hand found his face again, thumb brushing across his lips with a tenderness that made Ethan's breath catch. "I'm ready for people to know I'm with you," he said simply, his voice full of conviction. "That's all that matters to me." The words sent warmth spreading through Ethan's chest, a feeling of rightness and belonging that he had never experienced before. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it. This perfect combination of friendship and love and partnership. This sense of finally being exactly where he belonged. 3 weeks later, they had settled into a new rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, like they had simply stepped into roles they were always meant to play. The transition from friends to lovers had been surprisingly smooth, each day bringing small revelations about how perfectly they fit together, how their relationship had been building toward this moment for years without either of them fully realizing it. Brandon had broken things off with Jessica with a kindness that spoke to his character, explaining that he had realized he was looking for something different, something he had already found. The conversation had been difficult but necessary. And Brandon had come home that evening looking drained but relieved, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I told her I'd met someone," he had said, pulling Ethan into his arms. "I told her I was in love and that it wouldn't be fair to either of us to continue pretending otherwise." Ethan woke up that morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of Brandon humming in the kitchen, the same routine they had shared for years, but now infused with new meaning and possibility. The familiar sounds of their morning ritual felt different now, charged with the intimacy of two people who no longer had to hide their feelings from each other. He found Brandon standing at the counter, still in his pajamas, hair messy from sleep, and a smile on his face that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. The sight of him was still enough to take Ethan's breath away, even more so now that he was allowed to look freely, to appreciate the way the morning light caught the gold highlights in Brandon's hair, the way his t-shirt stretched across his shoulders, the easy grace with which he moved around their kitchen. "Good morning," Brandon said, turning to wrap his arms around Ethan in the same gesture that had started everything all those months ago. But now, instead of the careful distance Ethan had maintained, he melted into the embrace, tilting his face up for the good morning kiss that had become their new tradition. The kiss was soft and sweet, tasting like coffee and contentment and the promise of 1,000 more mornings just like this one. When they broke apart, Brandon rested his forehead against Ethan's, both of them smiling like teenagers with their first crush, giddy with the newness of being able to express their feelings so freely. "I still can't believe this is real," Ethan admitted, his arms tightening around Brandon's waist, reveling in the solid warmth of him. Brandon chuckled, pressing another quick kiss to his lips, then another to his forehead as if he couldn't help himself. "Believe it," he said, his voice warm with affection and certainty. "We're real. This is real. And I'm not going anywhere." They had breakfast together on the balcony, the same spot where they had shared so many meaningful conversations over the past months, where they had danced around the truth for so long before finally finding the courage to speak it. But now there was no tension, no careful navigation of dangerous topics. They could simply be themselves, completely and honestly, without fear of revealing too much or saying the wrong thing. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made everything feel possible, and Ethan found himself marveling at how different the world looked now that he didn't have to hide his feelings anymore. The trees in their courtyard were brilliant with fall color, and the sky was the kind of deep blue that only came with the changing seasons. "I have something to tell you," Brandon said as they finished their coffee, his tone suggesting something important but not alarming. Ethan felt a flicker of anxiety, old fears rising to the surface despite the security of their new relationship. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his mug and giving Brandon his full attention. Brandon reached across the table to take his hand, threading their fingers together in the gesture that had become second nature to both of them. "I told my parents about us yesterday," he said, his voice steady but carefully measured. "About you, about us being together." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, his heart racing as he processed what Brandon was telling him. "How did that go?" he asked carefully, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the anxiety that was building in his chest. Brandon smiled, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "Better than I expected," he said, relief evident in his voice. "My mom cried, but they were happy tears. She said she always wondered why none of my relationships seemed to make me truly happy. And now she understands. She wants to meet you properly, as my boyfriend instead of just my roommate." The word boyfriend sent a thrill through Ethan that he tried to hide, though from the knowing smile on Brandon's face, he wasn't entirely successful. They hadn't really discussed labels yet, had been taking things one day at a time, but hearing Brandon claim him so openly made everything feel more real, more permanent. "And your dad?" Ethan asked, remembering the few times he had met Brandon's father and trying to imagine how he had reacted to the news. Brandon's smile widened, his eyes bright with amusement and relief. "He said he's not surprised," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Apparently he's been waiting for me to figure it out for months. He said it was obvious to everyone but me how I felt about you, that I lit up whenever I talked about you in a way I never did when I talked about anyone else." Ethan laughed, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes as relief washed over him. "I'm glad they're supportive," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means everything." Brandon lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to Ethan's knuckles, the gesture tender and reverent. "They want to have us over for dinner next weekend," he said, his voice hopeful, "if you're ready for that." Ethan nodded, feeling overwhelmed by how quickly their life together was taking shape, how real and permanent everything was becoming. "I'm ready," he said, his voice strong with conviction. "I want to meet them as your boyfriend. I want all of this." The conversation was interrupted by Brandon's phone ringing, the sound cutting through the peaceful morning air. He glanced at the screen and smiled, showing it to Ethan. It was a text from his sister, congratulating them and asking when she could meet Ethan properly. "Word travels fast in your family," Ethan observed, reading the enthusiastic message over Brandon's shoulder. Brandon laughed, pulling him closer on the small balcony, their chairs scraping against the concrete as he maneuvered them together. "They're excited," he said, his arm wrapping around Ethan's shoulders. "They've been waiting for me to find someone who makes me happy, and now they have. They can see the difference in me." "What difference?" Ethan asked, curious about how their relationship appeared from the outside, how obvious their feelings had been to everyone but themselves. Brandon was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully, his fingers playing absently with the hair at the nape of Ethan's neck. "I'm more myself now," he said finally, his voice thoughtful and introspective. "More relaxed, more confident. I'm not constantly searching for something I can't name anymore. I found what I was looking for, and it was right here the whole time." The words sent warmth spreading through Ethan's chest, a feeling of completion that he had never experienced before. He thought about the journey they had both taken to get to this point, all the fear and confusion and careful navigation that had led them here, and he felt a deep gratitude for every moment of it, even the painful ones. That afternoon, they decided to take a walk through the neighborhood they had called home for the past 3 years, the familiar streets and shops that had been the backdrop for their friendship and now their love story. It was the same route they had walked countless times before, past the coffee shop where they spent their mornings, the bookstore where they browsed for hours, the park where they had shared so many meaningful conversations. But everything felt different now. Brandon held his hand openly as they walked, not caring who saw them, his fingers intertwined with Ethan's in a way that felt both natural and revolutionary. Ethan felt a freedom he had never experienced before, the simple joy of being able to show affection publicly, to claim the person he loved without fear or shame. They stopped at the coffee shop where they had spent so many mornings together, the place where Ethan had often graded papers while Brandon read the news, and they shared comfortable silence. The barista, who knew them as regulars, smiled when she saw them holding hands, her expression knowing and pleased. "It's about time," she said with a grin as she took their order, her voice warm with genuine happiness. "We've all been waiting for you two to figure it out. The way you looked at each other, it was so obvious to everyone but yourselves." Ethan felt his cheeks heat with embarrassment, but Brandon just laughed, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "Apparently we were the last to know," he said, his voice full of amusement and affection. They found their usual table by the window, the same spot where they had shared so many conversations that danced around the truth, where they had carefully navigated the space between friendship and something more. Now they could speak openly about their feelings, their fears, their hopes for the future, without the constant worry of revealing too much or crossing invisible lines. "I keep thinking about what you said about fate," Ethan said as they settled into their chairs, their hands still linked across the small table, "about how random it was that we found each other." Brandon smiled, his thumb brushing across Ethan's knuckles in the absent gesture that had become his habit. "Not random," he said, his voice full of conviction. "Meant to be. I truly believe that now. We were supposed to find each other, supposed to go through everything we went through to get here." Ethan squeezed his hand, thinking about all the moments that had led them to this point, all the seemingly insignificant decisions and chance encounters that had brought them together. The careful friendship, the hidden feelings, the gradual realization that what they had was more than either of them had ever experienced before. "I used to think loving you was the worst thing that could happen to me," Ethan admitted, his voice soft with the memory of all those months of hidden longing. "I thought it would destroy our friendship, that I would lose you entirely." "And now," Brandon prompted gently, his green eyes warm with understanding and love. "Now I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me," Ethan said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Even when it hurt, even when I thought it was hopeless, it taught me what real love feels like. It taught me that I was capable of loving someone that completely, that selflessly." Brandon's eyes softened at his words, thumb brushing across his knuckles with infinite tenderness. "I'm sorry you had to carry that alone for so long," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I wish I had been brave enough to figure out my feelings sooner." Ethan shook his head, bringing their joined hands to his lips to press a soft kiss to Brandon's palm. "We both needed time," he said firmly. "You needed time to understand yourself, and I needed time to learn how to be vulnerable. Maybe if it had happened sooner, we wouldn't have been ready for it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people pass by on the street outside, the familiar rhythm of their neighborhood continuing around them. Ethan marveled at how normal this felt, how right it was to be sitting here with Brandon as his boyfriend instead of just his friend. The transition had been so natural, so seamless, that it felt like they had always been meant to be together this way. That evening, they cooked dinner together in their kitchen, moving around each other with the ease of long practice, but now with the added intimacy of casual touches and stolen kisses. Brandon would brush past Ethan to reach for something in the cabinet, letting his hand trail across his back, his touch lingering just long enough to send sparks of electricity through Ethan's nervous system. Ethan would stand behind Brandon at the stove, arms wrapped around his waist, chin resting on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his skin and marveling at the fact that he was allowed to do this now. It was domestic and perfect, and everything Ethan had dreamed of during those long months of hidden longing. The kitchen that had been the site of so much careful distance was now filled with easy affection and natural intimacy, the space transformed by their honesty into something warm and welcoming and completely theirs. The simple act of cooking together felt revolutionary after so many months of maintaining careful boundaries. When Brandon reached for the salt and his arm brushed against Ethan's chest, neither of them pulled away. When Ethan leaned over Brandon's shoulder to check on the pasta, pressing a soft kiss to his neck in the process, Brandon leaned into the touch instead of pretending it hadn't happened. After dinner, they settled on the couch to watch a movie, the same couch where they had shared so many charged conversations and careful distances, where they had danced around the truth for months before finally finding the courage to speak it. Now Brandon pulled Ethan against his side without hesitation, and Ethan curled into him naturally, head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The movie played in the background, but neither of them was really watching. They were too caught up in the simple miracle of being able to hold each other like this, to express their feelings without fear or reservation. Brandon's fingers combed through Ethan's hair, and Ethan traced lazy patterns on Brandon's chest, both of them marveling at the freedom to touch and be touched. "I love you," Brandon said suddenly, the words soft but clear in the quiet room, cutting through the dialogue from the television. It was the first time either of them had said it directly, though it had been implied in everything they had shared over the past weeks. The words hung in the air between them, precious and perfect and long overdue. Ethan lifted his head to look at Brandon, seeing nothing but sincerity and tenderness in his expression, love written clearly across his features. "I love you too," Ethan replied, the words feeling like coming home after a long journey. "I've loved you for so long, I almost forgot what it felt like to say it out loud." Brandon cupped his face gently, thumb brushing across his cheek with infinite tenderness. "Say it again," he requested softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you," Ethan repeated, each word deliberate and sure, weighted with all the months of silence that had preceded this moment. "I love you, Brandon Parker. I love your kindness and your laugh and the way you make me feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Brandon's smile was radiant as he leaned down to kiss him, slow and deep and full of promise. The kiss tasted like love and gratitude and the future they were building together, like everything good and right in the world. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling, giddy with the freedom to finally say what they had both been feeling for so long. The movie played forgotten in the background as they talked about their future, about the life they wanted to build together. They talked about traveling, about the places they wanted to see, and the experiences they wanted to share. They talked about meeting each other's families, about the conversations they would need to have, and the support they hoped to find. They talked about the possibility of getting a bigger place where they could have an office for Ethan's grading and a workshop for Brandon's photography hobby. Everything felt possible now. Everything felt within reach. The careful boundaries they had maintained for so long had dissolved, replaced by an openness and honesty that felt revolutionary after so much hiding and pretending. They could dream together now, plan together, build a future that included both of them without reservation or fear. As they prepared for bed that night, Ethan marveled at how natural it felt to share the bathroom, to brush their teeth side by side, to change into pajamas without the careful modesty that had characterized their friendship. Brandon caught him staring in the mirror and smiled, pressing a kiss to his temple, his reflection meeting Ethan's eyes in the glass. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his arms wrapping around Ethan from behind, in an echo of that first morning when everything had changed. Ethan leaned back against him, enjoying the solid warmth of his chest, the security of being held like this. "Just this," he said, his voice soft with wonder. "How easy it is. How right it feels." Brandon's arms tightened around him, chin resting on top of his head as they swayed slightly together. "It does feel right," he agreed, his voice full of contentment and certainty. "It feels like we're finally where we're supposed to be." They climbed into bed together, Ethan's bed that had hosted so many nights of careful distance and hidden longing. So many moments when Brandon had appeared in his doorway seeking comfort, and Ethan had tortured himself with wanting more. Now they could curl together without pretense, Brandon's arms around Ethan as he settled against his chest, both of them finally able to relax completely. "Thank you," Brandon said quietly into the darkness, his voice soft and sincere. "For what?" Ethan asked, his fingers tracing abstract patterns on Brandon's chest. "For waiting for me," Brandon replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For being patient while I figured myself out. For loving me even when I was too scared to love you back." Ethan pressed a kiss to Brandon's chest, right over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his lips. "Thank you for being a worth waiting for," he said, his voice muffled against Brandon's skin. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell me the truth." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, finally able to rest without the weight of hidden feelings and unspoken truths pressing down on them. Ethan woke several times during the night, each time marveling at the fact that Brandon was really there, that this was really happening, that they had finally found their way to each other after so much time spent wanting and waiting. The next morning brought a lazy Sunday, the kind they had always enjoyed but now could share without reservation or the need to maintain careful distances. They made breakfast together, their movements synchronized after years of sharing the same space, but now enhanced by casual touches and soft kisses. They read the newspaper in bed, sections spread between them as they shared articles and commentary. Brandon's hand resting on Ethan's thigh in a gesture that was both possessive and tender. They took a long shower together, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks before, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. The intimacy of sharing such a private space, of seeing each other completely vulnerable and unguarded, was both thrilling and deeply meaningful. They washed each other's hair and traded lazy kisses under the warm spray, both of them laughing at the simple joy of it all. Everything felt heightened, more vivid, like the world had been painted in brighter colors. The coffee tasted richer, the sunlight streaming through their windows seemed warmer. Even the familiar furniture in their apartment looked different, transformed by the new energy between them. Brandon's phone rang while they were having lunch, and Ethan recognized the ringtone as the one assigned to Brandon's best friend from college. Brandon answered with a grin, putting it on a speaker so Ethan could hear the conversation, his free hand reaching across the table to link their fingers together. "Please tell me you finally told Ethan how you feel," the voice said without preamble, the exasperation clear even through the phone speaker. "I'm tired of listening to you pine over your roommate like some lovesick teenager." Brandon laughed, squeezing Ethan's hand across the table. "Actually, yes," he said, his voice warm with pride and happiness. "We're together now. Finally." The celebration that erupted from the phone was so enthusiastic that they both started laughing, the sound filling their small dining area with joy and warmth. Apparently, Brandon's friends had been waiting for this development as eagerly as his family had, watching from the sidelines as they danced around each other for months. "It's about time," his friend said, his voice full of relief and amusement. "We've all been placing bets on when you would finally get your act together. Sarah owes me $50. The call continued for another 20 minutes, filled with congratulations and demands for details and invitations to visit so everyone could meet Ethan as Brandon's boyfriend instead of just his mysterious roommate. When they finally hung up, both of them were smiling, their cheeks sore from laughing. "I think we were the only ones who didn't see this coming," Ethan observed, shaking his head in amazement at how obvious their feelings had apparently been to everyone around them. Brandon squeezed his hand, bringing it to his lips for a soft kiss, his eyes bright with love and amusement. "Maybe that's how it was supposed to be," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe we needed to find our own way here, in our own time without outside pressure or expectations." That afternoon, they went for a walk in the park, where they had spent countless hours over the past 3 years, the sprawling green space that had been the backdrop for so many of their deepest conversations. It was the same place where Brandon had often sought Ethan's advice about his relationships, where they had shared deep conversations about life and love and everything in between, always dancing around the truth of their own feelings. Now they walked hand in hand, no longer needing to maintain careful distances or navigate dangerous topics. The autumn air was crisp and clear, and the trees were brilliant with fall color, creating a canopy of gold and red above their heads. Other couples walked the same paths, and Ethan felt a deep satisfaction in being able to claim his place among them, to be part of the community of people who had found love and weren't afraid to show it. They found their favorite bench by the pond, the one where they had sat during some of their most meaningful conversations, where Brandon had unknowingly broken Ethan's heart a dozen times by describing the kind of connection he was looking for while it sat right beside him. Brandon pulled Ethan down beside him, arm around his shoulders, both of them watching the ducks glide across the water in lazy circles. "Do you remember the first time we came here together?" Brandon asked, his voice soft with nostalgia. Ethan smiled at the memory, leaning into Brandon's warmth. "You were stressed about a work presentation, and I suggested we get some fresh air. You bought us ice cream, and we sat right here while you practiced your speech." Brandon laughed softly, the sound rumbling through his chest where Ethan's head rested. "You were so patient with me," he said, his voice full of gratitude and affection. You listened to the same presentation 15 times and never complained, even though it was probably boring as hell. I liked listening to you talk, Ethan admitted, his fingers playing with the fabric of Brandon's jacket. I liked being the person you came to when you needed support. I liked feeling useful to you. You still are, Brandon said, pressing a kiss to his temple, his lips warm against Ethan's skin. You'll always be that person for me. The difference is now I can show you how much it means to me. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they made their way back to their apartment, their home, the place where they had built a friendship that had slowly transformed into something deeper and more beautiful than either of them had imagined possible. The familiar rooms felt different now, charged with new possibility and the promise of a future they could build together without fear or reservation. That night, as they prepared for bed, Ethan caught sight of himself in the bathroom mirror and was surprised by what he saw. He looked different, lighter somehow, like a weight he had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. The careful mask he had worn for so long was gone, replaced by an openness and joy that felt revolutionary. His eyes were brighter, his smile more genuine, his entire posture more relaxed and confident. Brandon appeared behind him in the mirror, arms wrapping around his waist, chin resting on his shoulder as he met Ethan's eyes in their reflection. You look happy, he observed, his voice soft with wonder and love. I'm happy, Ethan replied, leaning back against him, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. I'm happier than I ever thought possible. I didn't even know I could feel like this. Brandon's reflection smiled at him in the mirror, his eyes bright with the same joy that Ethan felt coursing through his own veins. Good, he said, his arms tightening around Ethan's waist. You deserve to be happy. We both do. They climbed into bed together, the routine that had once been fraught with tension now filled with easy intimacy and comfortable domesticity. Brandon pulled Ethan against his side, and Ethan settled there with a contentment that felt like coming home after a long journey through uncertain territory. I love you, Brandon whispered into the darkness, the words still new enough to send shivers down Ethan's spine, still precious enough to make his heart race with joy. I love you too, Ethan replied, the phrase that had once seemed impossible, now the most natural thing in the world, as essential as breathing. As they drifted off to sleep, Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the months of hidden feelings and careful friendship, the gradual realization that what they shared was more than either of them had ever experienced before, the courage it had taken to finally speak the truth that had been living in their hearts for so long. He thought about Brandon's question about fate, about whether their meeting had been more than just chance. Looking back now, it seemed impossible that they could have found each other any other way, impossible that they could have built something so perfect from such uncertain beginnings. Every moment of pain and confusion and careful navigation had been necessary, had led them exactly where they needed to be. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was simply two people who were brave enough to recognize something extraordinary when they found it. Maybe it was the kind of love that grows slowly, carefully, built on a foundation of friendship and trust and genuine understanding. Maybe it was the universe's way of showing them that the best things in life are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth the risk of everything falling apart. Whatever it was, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that this was where he belonged, here in Brandon's arms, in the life they were building together, in the love they had finally been brave enough to claim. The careful distance they had maintained for so long had given way to an intimacy that felt both thrilling and completely natural, like they had simply stepped into the roles they were always meant to play. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. There would be challenges, certainly, moments of doubt and difficulty as they navigated this new reality together. There would be conversations with family and friends, questions about their relationship, the need to define themselves in a world that didn't always understand or accept love like theirs. But they would face those challenges as partners, as equals, as two people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for without knowing it. As sleep finally claimed him, Ethan's last thought was of gratitude, for Brandon's courage in speaking the truth, for his own patience in waiting for the right moment, for the mysterious forces that had brought them together and given them the wisdom to recognize what they had found. He was grateful for every moment of pain and confusion that had led them here, grateful for the friendship that had been the foundation of their love, grateful for the chance to build a life with the person who understood him better than anyone else in the world. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard. The ones that grow from friendship into something deeper and more meaningful than you ever thought possible. Sometimes the person you're meant to love is right there beside you, waiting for you to be brave enough to see them clearly, to recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary, to understand that what you've been searching for has been there all along. And sometimes when you finally do see them, when you finally find the courage to speak the truth that has been living in your heart, you discover that they have been seeing you too, waiting for you to be ready for everything you could have together. Sometimes love isn't about finding someone new, but about recognizing the depth of feeling that already exists, about having the courage to transform friendship into something deeper and more lasting. In the quiet darkness of their shared room, in the apartment that had been the backdrop for their careful friendship and now their brave love, Ethan Ross and Brandon Parker slept peacefully, finally exactly where they were meant to be. The journey had been long and sometimes painful, but it had led them to this perfect moment, this perfect love, this perfect understanding that some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth risking everything to claim. Their love story wasn't the kind that happened overnight, wasn't the kind that swept them off their feet in a moment of dramatic revelation. It was the kind that grew slowly, carefully, built on a foundation of trust and understanding and genuine affection. It was the kind of love that would last, that would weather storms and celebrate victories, that would grow stronger with each passing day. And as they slept, wrapped in each other's arms, in the security of finally being honest about their feelings, the future spread out before them like an unwritten book, full of pages waiting to be filled with their story, their love, their life together.